The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives. My name is David Schoeneman. I'm your host on this program, and I'm the Alderman for Ward 3 here in Nashua. On Perspectives, we take a look at a variety of issues that are of interest to the Nashua resident, voter, and taxpayer on a state, local, and a national level. We do this to keep you informed on the issues that are affecting our society and to enable you to engage in the conversations as the opportunities arise. We also hope that you'll vote wisely when the time comes. This week, we're going to take a look at city government here in Nashua, particularly the new Board of Aldermen and the new legislative term just begun. With me to discuss these issues and the new term is my friend and Alderman from Ward 9, Ken Siegel. Ken was first elected in 2013, as was I, and we are now both in our second terms on the board. Ken, welcome to Perspectives.
Thanks, David. Glad to be here.
Well, thank you very much for coming in. We're sitting here in the Aldermanic chamber, where we have a new legislative term and a new board, new seats. Everything's new,
yes.
And we're facing some confusion and some contention. So there's a lot going on, and we're going to be facing more of that as we move into the budget season for 2017.
Yep, it has a different feel to it. I said after the last term, I felt like somehow that would be my favorite term as long as I served, because I really did make some very close friends, and I liked the way the board worked. So we'll see how things go this term. It would be hard to top last term as far as effectiveness.
I would agree with that. I think that since it was my first term, all I had known about the previous terms were what I had heard or seen, and it was very different to sit there. But when I compare last term to this term, the feel is entirely different. I think we were very productive, and it's going to be a challenge this year.
We'll see. I think there's, the change in some of the personnel is there's different viewpoints, and that's all very interesting. Mm-hmm. My biggest concern is I want to make sure that whenever people vote, it's an educated vote. That even if we differ in opinion, we differ based on having done our homework.
And we've seen some examples in the recent past where people were voting on things that they had no idea what they were talking about.
That's correct, and I think for me personally, that's a hot button issue for me.
Yeah.
And that did come up on our last Board of Aldermen meeting.
It certainly did, and we discovered that there were a number of people who really had no idea what legislation they were voting on in previous meetings, and yet wanted to try to resurrect something that was killed.
Right.
For what purpose? Maybe just to get their way or to spend supposedly free money, but it was not productive, and there was a lot of misinformation and lack of information present.
What happened was the previous Board of Alderman meeting, not this one Tuesday, but the one before that, we had a vote on a piece of legislation to accept or not accept a $40,000 grant to study the changing approach our health department would take depending on how climate changed throughout the world. And while this may be of some peripheral interest to us as a city, given the magnitude of some of the major problems we have to have that fit squarely in the domain of the health department, for example, opioid crisis, which is a huge problem for us, I felt that it would be an unnecessary drain on resources. Even if the money was coming from another source, if it was to have any effect on Nashua at all, it would mean that we would have to interact in some way, spend some time, manage the process, and when something was produced, assuming anything got produced of use, we'd have to react in some way or another. So either it requires no overhead, in which case it has no value whatsoever, or it requires some overhead, in which case we'd have to prioritize it depending on where things are with our other priorities. And I had asked Bobby Bagley, who has now been confirmed as the health department head, what her priorities were for the city of Nashua. Not one of them showed up on that list. And I asked that question intentionally at Monday's Personal Administrative Affairs Committee meeting because I wanted to see where that came in play. So fast forward, so in the previous meeting there was a vote 7-6 to indefinitely postpone this legislation. And there seemed to be some outcry because two of the principal sponsors weren't at that meeting.
But we asked people who were at the meeting, because there were some other sponsors who were at the meeting who could perhaps fill in for them and answer questions.
Correct.
The other sponsors who were there had no idea, and those 6 who voted in favor of it were not able to answer the questions either. What is this about?
Right. And the particularly telling statement to me was, well, if we don't take this money, someone else will.
Right.
Which I likened to walking down the street, finding a wallet on the ground and removing the contents of the wallet because if you didn't do it, someone else would. It's not our money. In an environment where people complain about wasteful spending, if you're taking money for a purpose that most people would agree is not a primary mission, then you can't say wasteful spending, because what you're really saying is, well, everyone else should stop wasteful spending, but we're allowed to have wasteful spending. Right. And so it has nothing to do with climate change denial or any of that nonsense. It was just, this was clearly not in the primary mission of our health department. And just because somebody worked hard to get a grant doesn't mean that we follow through, take the money and use it. It was just a poor direction to even apply for it, in my mind.
I would fully agree with that, and I voted the same way. Now, if someone were to say that you're against all grants, that's clearly not true, because the other night we had some new grants that were coming through, right, which you signed up to co-sponsor.
Absolutely.
HIV, STDs, there were a few others.
Right. There was one for tuberculosis, one for vaccination. And
these are all things that are important and high
correct.
Priorities.
Absolutely. I myself have taken advantage of the flu vaccination capabilities. And I think those are very, very clearly important, and those are direct public health functions. So it was a no question. That's certainly worth doing. So this isn't some war against the health department. It's just this happened to be the grant and the department. And I will, again, insist that we as a Board of Aldermen should understand what is it that we're voting on. At the very least, okay, this is money we voted to take or not take. Right now, the vote was to send it back to committee for a better vetting. But in my mind, the real lesson that should come out of this is if you're going to assign yourself to a piece of legislation, say, I support this, I want my name on that, I would think you owe it to yourself and the people you represent to know what it is you just signed up for, and to be in a position where you can explain that legislation to everyone else and make a case for why that should pass. Otherwise, don't sign up for it.
Right.
You know, or if you don't know what's going on and you're in a position to vote and you are concerned, then say, I'm not sure I have enough information. Is it possible that we can table this? There was no malicious intent to ram something through the board because these two people were absent. I mean, there's always going to be instances where people are absent. So it wasn't discourteous. And by the way, any of the co-sponsors of that legislation could have easily made a motion to table, which would have ceased debate right then and there. Yep. Nobody did, including, the person, Alderman Clemens, who decided that if we didn't take this money, someone else would. So I have a problem with that. And at that meeting on Tuesday, my motives were questioned as though I was doing this because I examined the room and decided I could get a vote through. This vote is not critical to me. Right. If it goes either way and that's the will of the board, that's fine. I'm not going to lose any sleep over anything like this. We're not even talking about money that's coming exclusively out of the taxpayer of Nashua's pockets.
But it is coming from the taxpayer.
It's coming
somewhere.
It is coming out of our collective pockets, and it is important to be aware of that. However, the lesson again is, why are we not doing our homework? Yes. Why are we showing up at board meetings and not knowing what we're talking about? That's not okay, and I hope that lesson got through. And I will say that I give our fellow Alderman, Tom Lopez, credit, because he was very upset at himself after that. I spoke to him at length about this, and he felt that he had let the board down because he was liaison to public health, and he felt he should have known more. And you know what? If nothing else comes out of it but that one alderman sort of learned an important lesson, then I think that's important. But as far as, why anybody would make this a holy war is ridiculous. And I'll tell you, I was a little bit annoyed with Alderman Clemens. After it was clear the will of the board was to reconsider this, that's fine. We always send things back to committee for reconsideration. Sure. And if the sense was that this needed to be better vetted, and the board clearly expressed that, okay, fine, send it back to committee and better vet it. Instead, a motion was made to consider it right then and there, where we had no additional information.
Right.
People who came in ignorant were just as ignorant as before.
Well, he's not interested in the knowledge, I don't think. I think he's interested. He was the one who was counting the votes. I think he looked around the room, he saw he had 2 extra people there, it was going to pass, and so he was more interested in getting that through.
Right, for what
Still not
purpose, I
being
don't
known.
understand.
Well, I think again, it's to win some kind of holy war. Our side beat your side, and the side that wants to spend defeated the side that wants to save. I think that's the goal.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to crawl into his head to
Sure.
question the motives. If it was just an incredibly silly thing to do.
Right.
And, of course, the board destroyed that motion because it was obviously not the will of the board or anything that we would do.
Right.
And I tell you, it made me miss Alderman Chassie, the prior Ward 6
Yes.
alderman, who's always said, we do not micromanage legislation at the full board level. If there's things that need to be changed or information that's not there that needs to be brought out, that's what committees are for. Mm-hmm. And I thought that Alderman Chassie's wisdom really made a lot of sense in the last term, and it certainly made sense the other night. I was glad to see most people shot that down. And frankly, I think our colleague did himself a disservice because it just was a silly thing to do that just ended up annoying everybody.
Well, I think he did himself a disservice, and I'm afraid he might have done the Board of Aldermen a disservice too, because folks at home are watching this, and I think are feeling frustrated, perhaps with all of us. Mm-hmm. So, how does this portend for the budget season coming up? We have somewhat dysfunctional board that displayed itself on Tuesday. We had a somewhat dysfunctional committee meeting on Monday involving some of the same players. Yeah. And now we're heading into budget season where it's going to be difficult. We're looking at 1.3 or 1.4% spending cap.
Right.
We've heard from the police department, from the police chief, Andy Lavoie, that the mayor has told them they can spend 2.5% over last year's budget. Mm-hmm. We've heard that schools were given 2, and we've also heard from the school board itself that the superintendent is looking for more than 2, and then all the other departments are 1.3. So if we have police at 2.5, schools at 2 or maybe a little bit more, and everyone else at 1.3, there's no way that's going to average out to 1.3 or 1.4. It's going to be beyond that, and it either means that there's got to be a spending cap override or something has to shrink.
Right. Now, you and I have gone through 5th grade math, and I think that apparently there seems to be an educational problem in Nashua if people don't know the...
We didn't go to Nashua schools, though.
We didn't go, yes, but there was the mean value theorem such that if all values are higher than your target, well, it's fairly safe to say you're not going to make your target unless something changes. So clearly a problem. Now, with the police department, we had a vote on the supervisor's contract. It was 3%. I didn't like the contract.
I didn't either.
But unfortunately, because of the Me Too clause in that contract, if we didn't vote for it, it would have gone to arbitration. The Me Too clause was explicit in the contract.
In the old contract, not just the new one, but in the previous contract.
The previous contract.
Because there were those who were arguing that it's only in the new contract, that if we just send this contract back, we can take that clause out. It's in the old one, and that's why it pertains.
Correct. That is exactly correct. And so it's in there, and one could argue whether or not we should do a better job negotiating contracts, but that ship sailed for that contract. Right. So if we had voted it down, it would have looked like a hero's vote, but it would have cost the city more money because we would have had to pay retroactively. We would have had the same contract in place. We would have had a very demoralized police force, and we would have had the legal expenses we'd have incurred to fight a losing war at arbitration. Contracts are fairly straightforward. That was a very, very explicit clause. There wasn't any hope of us winning in the courts on this, in my mind. And to Chief Lavoie's credit, he wasn't entirely thrilled with that clause either.
I agree completely. I have a lot of respect and give him a lot of credit for the excellent police department we have.
Right.
And the fact that I think he understands, as do some of the other folks in management at the police department, that taxpayers aren't happy with the way some of the things are going. Right. Not with the police department, but with expenses.
Right.
And they're making every effort they can to try to curtail that. We have some very serious issues. I think that public safety is a high priority. So to give 2.5% or whatever the percentage is, a necessary percentage to the police department, I'm not upset with that, and because I think that's the highest priority, especially with some of the things our city is facing. But some of the other choices I may not be quite as happy with, and I'm certainly not willing to pull stuff out of the budget to cut services in a way just to meet contracts for some other departments.
Yeah, we'll see what happens going forward. I've got some legislation that's going to be coming out, which is pension fund legislation. One of the problems with the budget is that it isn't that we grow a certain amount, because we have control over a certain percentage of our spending, but we don't have control over other parts of our spending. And the one particular bugaboo we're facing is a requirement by the state to pay down the deficiency in the state pension system. And every 2 years, there's an adjusted amount that the city has to pay. The city of Nashua has a certain percent obligation to the pension fund based on the workers that have been in the city's employ. And so we are responsible for a percentage of that shortfall. And the way that it's been legislated is it's a 30-year pay down, and at 100%, after 30 years, we get to 100% funded. And it's an interesting model in that we shouldn't necessarily have to be at 100% funded, but that's the way it is right now. So every 2 years that's adjusted what we have to pay, and that can go up or down. And every percentage change in that obligation is a $50 million swing for the city of Nashua. So right now, the investment performance target is pegged at 7.55%, which is fairly aggressive. It's based on, the good news is just that the numbers are based on the actual performance of the portfolio over a particular period of time. But the problem is, the next adjustment period, it could fall down below that, in which case, whatever we have now, which is a bad obligation, will be worse, because we have to take that $50 million divided out amongst the number of years that we have to pay, in addition to our prior obligations, and it's fairly significant. Right now, we're looking at 22 more years, I believe, in this program. So we're talking on the order of about $2.4 million swing for every percent difference. So that's significant, very significant. So what to do? Now, in the previous term, Mayor Lozo had a proposal to take the $2.23 million that was in our reserve fund that was specifically allocated to pay down a pension obligation and for no other purpose, and to then create an expendable trust fund, put the money in that, and use that and say, okay, that goes to that expendable trust fund with no expiration will be used just for pension obligations. So the problem that I had was not so much the $2.23 million that we had set aside that was earmarked, that if we took, it would have no change to taxpayer obligations. And after all, the spending cap is about controlling taxpayer obligations to the city. Okay, so this money's already set aside, and if we take it, it doesn't change anything. Okay, but here's the problem. So we take that money, we put it in, and we have a fund that lasts for 22 years, and so now we've spent it all, and I believe the mayor's intent was to spend a good chunk of it, most of it, in her last year in office, and which was great for her, but not so good for the rest of the time. So now we have a little bit of residual money, we use that, but now what happens? We have this expendable trust fund, it hasn't gone away, and now it's a side door, and now to fill that bucket, that is an obligation for the taxpayers. And now I have a problem, okay, because now you're asking the taxpayers to fund an obligation that was part of the spending cap. And now we've created a side door and it's not. So in this term, I took the idea that was put forth and I tried to preserve the good parts of the idea and eliminate the bad parts in my mind. And to find a mechanism by which we could actually change the underlying problem so that once the money ran out, we wouldn't be in this catastrophic situation. So the legislation is written to create an expendable trust fund which lapses after 3 years. It takes the $2.23 million, it transfers it into that expendable trust fund and slices it into 3 equal parts, which are to be used to pay down the pension obligation. So 1/3 over, $700,000, about $750-something thousand, $755,000 per year will go towards paying down that pension obligation, and only paying down the pension obligation, not, hey, let's put new contracts in place, let's not do other things. The reason it's for 3 years is to allow a window by which we can hopefully get legislation at the state level to change the funding percentage so that it goes below this absurd 100%. That's the idea, and give us some longer-term breathing room. So what happens if we fail? After 3 years, no headway's been made. Well, guess what? Then we failed. And that's just the way it is. And
right.
If the voters of Nashua want to find a different way of doing things, that's fine. But under the existing system, where we have a cap and we don't want to change the taxpayer obligation, we don't want to create a permanent side door.
No,
Or let's put it this way, some people might, I don't. And the intent of this legislation is to try to figure out a way to get that money, which doesn't have a taxpayer impact, and use it in an intelligent way. See, that's the problem. The tax cap is a great idea.
Spending cap?
Or the spending cap, rather. I said tax. The spending cap is a great idea in certain respects, but the actual mechanics work in very unusual ways, which can be detrimental. So, for example, taking this, it's an issue. It shouldn't be as much of an issue, but let's face it, it is. A worse example that I would use is, say, a wealthy businessman wants to donate $50 million and earmark it to use for youth services. Tremendous thing. As a board of aldermen, we'd probably all sign up to create an expendable trust fund, accept that money. Why not? What a great idea. Except we couldn't spend it because that expenditure would count against the cap. So imagine a situation where our pension obligations go up, the implicit price deflator, government price deflator, which is the new index that we use, is hovering around, say, 0.8% for that year. It's a 3-year rolling average, actually. So say it comes out to like 0.8%. The pension obligation goes up so high that our actual net budgeting change is negative, potentially. So obviously we can't say we're going to take out of this pool and spend it. We'll be cutting elsewhere.
We are going to be cutting elsewhere, and it is a complex issue. I think when the state pushes this stuff down to the city level like this, I think what they're essentially saying is, we the state, we can't fix this. Here, you guys fix it. You deal with it.
Right.
And I'm not sure, my personal view is that I'm not sure that the best way to deal with it is just to find a way to spend the money. My biggest issue...
By the way, obviously what I was saying about my legislation, I would agree with you, since the whole point was to buy the window of time to change it at the state level.
Yes. One of the ramifications of this transfer, of course, is that it inflates the fiscal 2016 appropriations, which becomes the new base for the fiscal 17 spending. So by transferring this money out, it really is an appropriation. It requires 10 votes. That's, I think, what is going to give the city the headroom, what people tend to call it, to spend more for the contracts or whatever else.
Okay, that's not the intent.
I know that's not the intent, but it's an unintended consequence. And I think it's a serious unintended consequence. Because it allows that additional spending. I think what folks want is they don't want the spending. And granted, it is an account that's been set aside for this purpose, but it's taxpayer-raised money. It's taxpayer money.
Right.
And when it's spent, it would seem that it should count towards the spending cap. But I understand that we're between the proverbial rock and a hard place this term. This is going to be a hard one.
Right.
It's going to be a hard one.
So I think we have to couple the reality that we're living with a sense of still maintaining some fiscal discipline. And, it always strikes me as amazing that there's this sense of entitlement to salary increases. And there's plenty of industries where these circumstances where people are being laid off, there aren't salary increases.
Exactly.
And the people that are working there recognize that if I take a salary increase, the person that's sitting next to me is losing their job. So what's more impactful? Not receiving a small salary increase when you're already earning a reasonable living, or losing your job entirely, so that your next paycheck is zero. And I find it troubling.
I find it very troubling. And I think that if we take a look at the custodian contract for the school department issue, what we find here is that there would have been a contract that would have gone up again had we entered into negotiations and moved forward based on all the evidence from preceding contracts. And I can picture the arguments around the horseshoe here when the time would come. It's fair. It's the right thing to do. Meanwhile, what we found from the private contractor bids is that the least favorable bid would save us about $500,000 a year, and the most favorable bid would save us about $3.5 million a year. That would be an amount right there that could cover that pension expense. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. I understand they're taking it to the labor board, all this kind of stuff. It's complex, but what it does show us is that, generally speaking, at least in that case, we've been spending more than market value for custodial services.
Well, you and I will disagree a little bit about this particular issue. one, the custodians were more than willing to flatline their contract, and they'd still be willing to flatline their contract. So they're actually not looking for an increase. In fact, the custodians in the last contract we voted for, which had an increase, the ones that I know, because as a member of Club National, there's a bunch of them that are there, were upset with the contract. They did not want the salary increase. All they wanted was to have less restrictive work rules that require them to come in at times when they'd like to spend time with their family. And so that's what they actually wanted. So, and even going forward, they'd be more than happy to flatline their contract. That's what I've been told. That's what I've been told by their union representatives. So that part is a little bit of maybe a difference than what people may think. The other thing is I'm not 100% sure about some of these savings, because the problem is, at what point are we actually getting what we're paying for? And I'm not claiming that we're already getting what we're paying for. I would really like to see a little bit more of a crackdown on certain abusive employee practices.
Yes, there are some of those.
And so hopefully together that everybody could work on that. I mean, even the people that I speak to within the union there recognize that there are certain employees that are flatly taking advantage of the system. So hopefully that'll change. But are we really going to get the value that we think we're going to get? If you actually look at the labor numbers and the turnover rates that are most likely for salaries levels that low, you're not going to get a consistent workforce, and you're not going to get a quality workforce. And I'm a little concerned about having a high turnover and possibly less than desirably vetted personnel working directly with our children. That's really sort of the issue there. It's a very, very different circumstance in, say, cleaning an area, like parking garages or something like that. I mean, you've got a bunch of personnel that are very clearly in contact consistently with children. And, let's face it, I think that if you're going to pay people close to minimum wage for that position, it's not clear we're going to get the best possible pool of applicants and the most desirable pool that you would want around the kids. That's the issue. And I think perhaps you might remember in the previous term of the board, we had a busing contract that we voted on. We voted for one that was a little over $200,000 more expensive than the next competitive bid. The reason was that other busing company, while cheaper, had a history of labor problems. And we were very, very concerned that we'd have a bunch of disgruntled bus drivers for the next 3 years driving our kids around.
Sure. And
it just did not seem to be a really effective trade-off. And so I see this as somewhat similar. Mm-hmm. So everything's different. And again, you got a company like Aramark, and I don't know how they will or won't operate, but are we really going to be going to court to determine, like, this floor is clean? No, it's not. This, did you do your work? No. A private company is going to have a lot of add-ons that they'll throw at you. It's kind of not the same kind of let's try to work together. Now, admittedly, a union has very strict work rules, and some of the stories that we've heard are
pretty bad,
horrific. Yeah. And listen, they deserve some of the scorn, like giving Charlie Katsoas a hard time for taking the garbage out at Charlotte Ave School, or this idea of interfering with the Fidelity folks volunteering.
That was terrible.
Absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
Hopefully that kind of stuff won't happen going forward, and there'll be some flexibility, and recognize that people have to work together and not be so foolish.
What helps grant that flexibility, if there is going to be any, is the understanding that there is competition, and we do have to be competitive. Everyone has to be competitive. And right now, I think that when a union is formed, it's probably formed primarily for the purpose of escaping the competitiveness aspect. Mm-hmm. And that can be on salary, it can be on work rules, it can be on a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And certainly we'd have to vet the contracts very, very carefully. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure the school board is going to work on that. It's going to take some time.
I'm not confident that they'll necessarily do the same level of vetting that was required. Now, I'm a little bit concerned that people have been needlessly bashing the school board. I think it's destructive, because you can't keep saying, you're terrible, you're terrible, you're terrible. Oh, anyone else want to run for school board? Oh, sure, I'd love to put myself in the crosshairs of 2/3 of the population yelling and screaming at how terrible we are.
Well, there was an editorial in the Telegraph a couple days ago that was addressing some of the complaints about the contention on the school board. And it actually had sided with the fact that a little disagreement is okay as part of healthy government.
Right.
And it's not deserving of scorn.
Correct.
Just because there's a 5-4 vote, for instance, or even a lot of 5-4 votes.
Right.
It's government in a self-governed society following rules of majority and
We're going to see it in
democratic
our
rule.
own Board of Aldermen.
You know,
We're probably
we
going
are.
to see a lot of 8-7 votes,
We probably will.
which is, we'll see how that goes.
It's going to be an interesting term, no doubt about it.
Yeah, I'd like to believe that everybody's going to vote in the best interests of the city and not make this into some sort of holy war, but there's at least a couple of our
Well-
colleagues, I think, that don't necessarily have that same viewpoint.
And it only takes a couple.
Yeah.
We've had a few new people on the board. I think some good replacements and some replacements that are going to be a little more difficult for us, contribute to the dysfunction as opposed to fix it. But again, going back to what we saw on Tuesday night, I think there were some lines drawn there, lines drawn in the sand about what kind of position people are going to take on various issues.
Right, and for a silly reason.
For a silly reason. So when it's an important reason, I think we might see heels dug in even more firmly.
I think budget season is going to be fascinating, and
Yes.
it's just, let's see if people know how to do math. A lot of pretenders to knowledge of economics and the way budgets work. I always find it fascinating. People that have never actually had to run a business,
Right.
never actually had to own a budget, responsibility for a budget and the consequences, all of a sudden pontificating about budgets and spending, and you just want to say, and you got this knowledge where? From your parents' basement? Where did that happen?
I think it's very telling that Alderman McCarthy had difficulty filling budget and finance this year.
Right.
Those are two of the most important committees in the city on
Absolutely.
any government level.
I was
In
shocked.
the last term, people were clamoring to get on those committees.
Correct.
And this term, with the new people, they're trying to stay away. And then those same folks start arguing about budget this and budget that.
Right.
And that was very telling. I was shocked also. I thought these are the most important things.
I was especially surprised that finance did not have an overwhelming number of people that want to be on it, because it's by far the most powerful aldermanic committee. It has final discretion over all spending between $10,000 and $999,999. And I mean, it's so important to get that right.
Yes.
And just the lack of interest. I don't get it. Like, why are we here? Were we just because we like the title?
Well, maybe so. But really, it's finance and budget that are the two most important. I think infrastructure is important too because it deals with things that the folks face every day. But
Finance and budget require the most work. And I think
They
that was
require the most
probably,
work. I
that's
think
probably
that's
why there was an issue.
a big factor.
Finance has meetings every 2 weeks by statute.
Mm-hmm.
They have to happen, and you get a large document package. You have to review contracts, and you have to review, well, don't have to. I mean, if you're doing your job, you're supposed to review the record of
Yes.
expenditures, which is every penny the city spends is documented. It's excellent. We certainly have a tremendous amount of documentation, and CFO Griffin is fantastic. You ask any
Yes.
question, he's great at getting back to you about stuff. So
Yep, I agree.
if you do your job.
Well, that's the hard part. This is, after all, still a volunteer job, but someone who's going to do it should be prepared to step up and do the work.
Well, it's an elected position, not volunteer.
True.
And we do get compensation for that. So we'd like to see, hopefully, people at least try to earn their compensation.
Yes.
And earn the respect of the voters that put them in office.
Right.
And do their job.
Do their job.
It's not really that hard to
No,
do
and
your
it's fine.
job.
Right.
It is a hard job, but it shouldn't be that hard to have an attitude that you're going to do the right job.
Right.
But to not only walk into a meeting with no clue about legislation, but to then, when that legislation is going to be brought up again, still have no clue.
Yeah, I know.
It's very frustrating. Like,
Yeah.
because I knew what it was about when I objected to it, and I certainly knew what it was about when we had additional information provided, which made it even clearer that it was useless.
Yes, and many of the folks, it appeared to me, on Tuesday night had not read that memo that came out.
Had no clue. They didn't
No
even
clue.
know what we were talking about. It was attached to the agenda.
Right, and Alderman Cookson raised a typo question,
Right.
and clearly no one else had noticed that.
It was a cut and paste.
It was a cut and paste.
And when I read the original document and I looked at some of the stuff written in it, it was obvious that this was just boilerplate.
Right, I have it right
And
here.
some of the, the English, the phrase that I quoted was just, even Alderman McCarthy at the time said, I agree, I don't understand what they're even talking about.
Let's share this with the folks. as
Sure,
long as we
why
got it
not?
right
Go
here.
for
This is purpose of the grant initiative. This is from a memo. It's entitled Clarification to the National Board of Aldermen. this grant is to develop a climate and health adaptation plan for the greater Nashua public health region and implement an evidence-based intervention to address a top priority health impact / burden related to weather / climate vulnerability aimed at improving public health at the population level.
Complete gibberish.
And
Nobody could even understand how that clarifies
Right.
anything. And to me, I read that and I said, yep, that pretty much seals the deal. I thought this was ridiculous, and this was supposed to make me think that it isn't ridiculous.
I know.
And it just basically was another nail in the coffin. And the problem is, I think, between certain of our colleagues not even reading this and understanding what they were voting for and just saying, yeah, let's just vote to do this because it's money that we get, and certain others saying, well, it's like some sort of a holy war, we're going to jam this through because it's like a contest. To me, it was a circus.
It was a circus. I think there are some wiser folks on that board, though, who may have voted for it or supported it the first time around, and maybe they're having some second thoughts, because the more you look at it, even though they did support it first time around, maybe they'll come around and change their mind. We'll see.
We'll see.
Let's touch briefly. We've got a few more minutes left. Let's touch briefly on Monday night's meeting, and particularly the code enforcement legislation introduced.
Sure.
Code enforcement, of course, is a department within City Hall that's responsible for enforcing the code. Code exists for tenants and landlord situations. You have to have smoke detectors, egress. It exists for restaurants. You have to have a smoke hood and all these different kinds of things. Lots of code in the city. And if there's an issue with code in a restaurant or an apartment building, something like that, a tenant or a patron can call code enforcement and say, hey, these guys aren't doing something right. It's a public safety issue. Go and check it out. Code enforcement folks, they're very responsible and very responsive. They head out. I've called them a few times for issues in Ward 3. They head out, take a look at the situation, and they speak to the person involved. They don't name names, whoever complained, and they try to get whatever's wrong fixed and made right.
Right.
And if a landlord doesn't comply, for instance, then ultimately it goes to court, and they're probably forced to comply, but it can take a period of time.
Right.
So you introduce some legislation that would maybe streamline that process, and since it's going to happen anyway, maybe provide a little more impetus for the landlord fixing something before it gets to the go-to-court stage.
Right. So right now, none of the regulations have changed about what code you have to adhere to. So if you're code compliant, there's no change whatsoever. What we've done is try to introduce legislation that has a ticketing system. So instead of having to go to court to try to get a fine enforced, we just issue a ticket which is akin to the same procedure as a parking ticket. And the fines are not horrendous. And remember, the code enforcement people informally now work with landlords, restaurant owners, whatever, to get compliance. This legislation actually forces that. The first time that they come out, they cannot issue a summons. There's a warning. So their natural inclination, the way they work anyway, is now not even discretionary. They have to give you a warning and have to give you the opportunity to correct that, which is all we want anyway.
Sure, but if they show up and they find that there's really no problem, they don't have to give a warning then.
No, absolutely not. They'll say there's no. So they're not out there to try to.
There's no quota system.
Right. There's no quota system. There's no.
that.
This isn't the code enforcement Gestapo.
Right.
It's more to have a better system than to have us go into court every time.
Which takes a long time.
And a lot of time, money,
Costs
and it's
money.
also, and the city has a limited amount of bandwidth in our legal department, and that's not the way we want to spend it. And the problem is that the landlords that are active scofflaws know this, and so they want us to go to the courts. They want a system that they can just drag things out through the courts.
It's going to cost us money.
Yeah, they just don't want to bother.
Hopefully we'll just drop it.
Right, exactly. And so we wanted to just put more effective teeth into things. And those landlords that don't have problems now aren't going to have problems. And nothing's changed there.
Right.
So that meeting became a bit of a zoo because despite all of the things that were said, both by myself and the representative from Code Enforcement, where everything was clearly outlined, people were making comments from the audience, and not just making comments, they were yelling comments from the audience, not even in proper public comment. About this legislation that wasn't true. And I have to say that I found it the most frustrating meeting I've ever attended as an alderman. And the chairman of the committee should have kept things under control and was allowing just basically yelling and screaming from the audience.
Right.
And this issue was actually raised at our full board meeting in the alderman comment section. Alderman Melizzi Golia pointed out that it seemed like things were out of control.
Right.
And which is, I mean, for Alderman Melizzi-Golia to point out is rather unusual. I mean, she wasn't there but knew about it. And so hopefully that'll change. But we can't run meetings that way.
No, we certainly can't.
It was out of control. And again, it was very frustrating for me because it was just a lot of yelling and people just yelling about stuff that were just wrong.
Just wrong. So hopefully we'll see if they come out for the full board meeting where it's going to be decided on then, voted on then as well. I did receive a call from a large landlord actually who owns a lot of properties throughout the city and certainly in Ward 3. And of course, anyone who's a landlord for a lot of properties has probably received a call and code enforcement has stopped by, that kind of thing. And so he's worked with code enforcement before. But he let me know, he was at the meeting. He did not speak at that meeting. He let me know prior to the meeting and then afterwards that he thinks the legislation is good, that some of these folks who are good landlords were misunderstanding and were fearful without any reason to be.
Well,
and he supports it and he thinks that it's going to be better overall.
Well, I appreciate that, and hopefully he'll provide some public comment to that effect, because I think we need a little bit more balance.
Right.
There was one comment that was made that I think was something worth considering, where somebody had said, well, what happens when tenants damage property and then code enforcement comes and now I can be fined for that? And my statement to that is nothing's changed. Tenants are not going to be going on rampages because of this change in legislation. There's already bad tenants damaging property.
Right.
And you know, those people that were yelling at the city as though this was a city problem to solve, it's still a civil action between a tenant and a landlord, no matter what. That's not something that we're going to get in the middle of, except now, again, we formalized the discretionary part, where code enforcement say, look, okay, we understand the situation, and just work to get it fixed. And as long as there's a good faith attempt to get it fixed, then okay. And by the way, landlords haven't forfeited their right to go to court if they feel that something is
that's right.
is a problem.
Right, that's their appeal process.
That's their appeal. It's just that now the onus is on them. You know, if there's an issue and they want to contest it, then fine, they can initiate a court proceeding and we'll address it then. But we shouldn't have to initiate a court proceeding every time we want to enforce a code violation.
Right, so this basically changes the way the court proceeding is arrived at.
Correct.
The city's not bringing someone to court. Now, this landlord, scofflaw landlord, is being fined, and if he wants to contest that, then he has to initiate
Correct.
the court proceeding.
Correct. And again, these fines are not
No, they're not
outrageous.
They're not outrageous.
And I might add that I wanted to make the third offense fines much, much higher, because I wanted them to be really, really a deterrent. And the code enforcement folks and the health department did not want to do that. And so I have to defer to staff on that. I think that they are in a much better position to judge these things. So that change to the legislation that I proposed did not happen before it was introduced. So I think code enforcement's been reasonable so far, and nobody who was there at that meeting had negative things to say about code enforcement. That was the funny thing.
Right.
Everyone said, yes, they've always been fair, they've always been reasonable, they've always worked with. So now there's this legislation, and all of a sudden there's this belief, oh, it's going to turn them into the code enforcement Gestapo. That's not the point.
No, I don't think that'll happen, and certainly the city of Nashua would never tolerate that.
No.
And the Board of Aldermen wouldn't tolerate, the mayor wouldn't tolerate, no one would tolerate that. And
Right.
I don't know anyone in the City Hall who would behave that way anyway.
Right.
Now, we never know the future, who's going to be occupying some of these roles, but
There are safeguards both on one
Right.
side on the court system. If there's overall consensus within city government that yes, in fact, this is a legitimate thing. But even short of that, if there's something which has gone wrong, where there's some future employee which has gone rogue, there's plenty of safeguards where we'll
Yes.
say, like, no, that's not going to happen. And we all, as aldermen, we can get constituent calls and investigate and find out
That's
what's
right.
going on.
That's right. And I would certainly encourage landlords to call. I wanted to talk to some of those folks. I've spoken with some of those folks who spoke up on Monday night on other issues. And, I think they know that they can contact us if they have an issue, and they can do it if this legislation passes. too.
By the way, I might point out, for all the people that claim they were blindsided, the Substandard Living Conditions Committee is ultimately what was the genesis of this legislation, because code enforcement spoke before us and said this would be a toolkit they'd like, and so the process was initiated. And we've been reaching out to landlords consistently, and they've refused to give us to come before us, and we haven't had any opportunity to tour certain sites. So, and this has been on the front page of the Telegraph, these
Yes, it
issues.
has.
So there's no secret that things are going on here. And for somebody to claim they didn't know about these regulations or the code enforcement, or where can I find a code handbook, you're telling me that you manage property for years in Nashua and you don't have a Nashua code handbook? How is that possible? It's hard for me to be very sympathetic.
Sure.
So,
Well, I hope this landlord, I encouraged him to come out and speak, and he said he was going to. So hopefully he'll come out. And like I say, he's a large landlord, and or landlord with a lot of properties, I should say.
Right.
Opposed to a large landlord. No offense. And he'll speak in favor of it because he believes that it would be good for the city overall.
I would like to think that a majority of my colleagues on the board support this.
I would think so.
It got very good support at the PAA, so
Yes.
we'll see.
Good. Well, Ken, we're nearly out of time. Anything else you want to add for the folks? Do you
No.
enjoy being an alderman, and would you encourage someone else to run in the future? Not against you, but
Well, if they want to run against me, that's fine.
Bring it
I mean,
on.
if anybody that doesn't think I'm doing a good job, I think if they have a large number of my constituents that would agree with them, they should run against me.
well, you had no opponents this last round.
I did not, which I have to say was probably a good thing given the amount of other things I had to do. It would
Sure.
have been very difficult for me to have done the door-to-door campaigning I did the first time. I always urge people to get involved. I have a real problem with people that think that civic involvement is sitting on your couch, reading the Telegraph, and then writing cliche replies to articles in the commentary section.
Right.
Or getting on Facebook and saying, here's what I think we should do, which translates into, here's what I think other people should do, but
me.
not me.
Right.
And so,
I
really,
think it's good to be involved. Really involved.
really
not
involved.
Just
Do your homework, really
do your
involved.
homework. Really involved. Not spectating on the couch and not just
Right.
doing a Facebook thing.
Right. The city could use it. And to the credit of a lot of people in the city, both that work for the city and the volunteers, we have a very, very good employees, and we have a lot of really good people that volunteer their time. It's
do.
tremendous. And it's one of the things that's most rewarding that you learn
Yeah.
from being in city government is how many good people work for the city and work with the city in a volunteer capacity.
It's true. Well, Ken, thank you very much for coming in. I appreciate it. And
Thanks, David.
thank you, folks, for tuning in. Been watching Perspectives with David Schoeneman. I'm your host and Alderman for Ward 3, and my friend Ken Siegel, Alderman for Ward 9. Thank you very much. If you have any questions or comments, please reach us at perspectivesnh@gmail.com. And we'll see you next time.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.